Hello, I'm Jack Hoeck from Rexius Forest Byproducts, and I'm going to be sharing a little bit today about the kind of the background of the company and how we ended up being in the composting and organic recycling arenas. So, back in the late 30s, a man named Saul Rexius started a business in Eugene, and his focus was taking wood scraps from sawmills and other residual products like sawdust, that type of thing, and it was used for fuel. So the company was called Rexius Fuel Service back then, and so we had this fleet of trucks that Saul would run around town and pick up sawdust from the sawmills and deliver it to people's houses. Lots of sawdust furnaces back then, and so kind of like a coal furnace, people used sawdust as heat, and they would put the sawdust in their basement, and he would shovel it into the basement or have a series of conveyors that would take it into the basement, and then you put it in a bin, and people would use that to heat their homes. It was inexpensive, it was readily available, and it was a product that didn't have a lot of other uses at the time. Some people could use it for animal bedding and this, that, but the other product that he had was firewood, and it was slab wood. And so the sawmill would take the logs and cut them square on the edges, and there would be this half round piece of bark and some wood on it, and that's how they took the bark off of the logs. And so he would cut those into pieces for firewood and also deliver those as heating source. That was great in the fall and winter, but in the summertime there wasn't much firewood being burned or sawdust. So we needed to diversify that. The sawmills, if they didn't have a use for this material like a fuel source, they would have to burn it. And there was these steel structures, they were called wigwam burners or teepee burners, and they just put all the scrap that they couldn't dispose of in there, and it would burn. And about that period of time, there was approximately 40 sawmills around the Eugene Springfield area. So all of these wigwam burners would be producing smoke, and must have been a pretty smoky community back then. So as time evolved, sawmill technology changes, and that affected what the products that we had to sell. One of the changes is that the material was cut with a circular saw, which cut a big fat piece of sawdust, like almost like a small kernel of corn. So it flowed good, it was reasonably dry, made a pretty good fuel source, almost like a mini wood pellet, I guess it would be a way to describe it today. So as sawmill technology changes, they went to bandsaws, which was much smaller size sawdust, and then they would put water on the bandsaw to keep it cool. Well, now we have a small piece of sawdust that's wet, and so over time, as more and more of that technology was adopted, the sawdust became very difficult for people to burn, and so that had to be transitioned out, move them away from the sawdust furnaces, and so that was one thing that changed. The other thing that changed was to make more efficient use of the wood. They, rather than cut these slabs off, they would ran it through what was called a debarker, and that would just knock the bark off of the wood. And so they had another product now that was a residual product that was more bark, less wood or sawdust content. And so that lent itself more for landscaping purposes. And so we bought some equipment to screen and process that material to size it appropriately for landscape purposes. And then also for making soil amendments and that type of thing. So not only a decorative bark, weed barrier, moisture control, all of that, but there was also components that could be put into with the primarily the bark, sometimes sawdust, but animal manures, those types of things. So we were able to start making soil amendments, planting mixes, garden soils, started bringing in animal manures to make compost, some crop residuals like mint straw, those types of things that could be composted that had a higher nutrient content. And so these transitions really started to accelerate in the 60s, and that's kind of when the company was still big into fuel. There was an industrial fuel component as well, and so as the sawmills changed the technology to these debarkers, there was equipment that would downsize these big slabs of wood and pieces of wood into a more manageable size, so that could be conveyed and transported easily. So it went through a device called a hammer hog, and so it made probably a 4 to 5 inch minus piece of these wood scraps. So those were also burned for fuel. Both the University of Oregon and eWeb had big steam plants. Again, these were waste products, very inexpensive, so they were really good for fuel. And so University of Oregon had a steam plant that they heat the central district of the campus with steam. Sacred Heart Hospital also was heated by steam. And eWeb had a steam plant where there was a central heating district in downtown Eugene, which was all steam heat. And so they produced this heat and used it as a power source. So over time, we had a branch that was doing more of a landscape supply type materials, and then also a transportation side that was mainly just hauling materials. And so as time went on, those became, a good business. Well, in the early 80s, late 70s, there was one of the first housing recessions that I remember, and all of a sudden home building across the country virtually stopped. And when that happens, there's not need for all the wood products. So when that happened, there was a period of several years where there's very little sawmill production. And these big industrial users like the University of Oregon and eWeb had a real tough time coming up with enough fuel to meet their needs. So they both started transitioning away from this product into natural gas and converted their steam plants. They didn't have these big piles of sawdust and wood scraps in the environment, which was they could catch on fire, or they dusty, the wind would blow. So it just made more sense for them to move away and have a consistent supply. They could turn the pipe on, get the energy they needed. They didn't have this other legacy. Once home building came back, those were two significant users of material from this area. So we really then started to market the material a lot more aggressively. We started a bagging plant for more distribution. And so those are just kind of some of the evolutions of where we got to in the 80s. Now we're in the late 80s, early 90s. We started looking on a nationwide basis of everything going into the landfills, and was there something that we could do to remove the amount of material going to the landfill? And organic material, mainly yard debris and food waste, made up a significant portion, probably 35 to 40% conservatively of the material that was in the landfill could be used in a different way, either making a compost or some other product out of it. So Lane County, like many counties across the country, were source separating the material. So if it didn't get commingled into the pit, it could be diverted into making compost. And so we were familiar with composting. We had the equipment to do it. We had screens and processing equipment. So we naturally just kind of went to composting these materials, and that was very successful. We were able to market those and incorporate them into our other soil products, and that was great until the early 2000s. They do more inventories of what's in the landfill. Lots of organic material still there. So food waste was the next thing that was identified that could be source separated, pulled out, collected separately, and the emphasis was not only reducing landfill, but now we're thinking more about climate. And when you put food waste in particular that's wet, there's lots of energy, nitrogen in it, when you put it in a landfill, it creates methane gas and leachate. And so both things that environmentally are challenging to deal with. So there was an emphasis to move into more food waste composting. again, but ultimately we felt there was still too much contamination in the compost, so we moved away from accepting anything other than just pure food in the food waste compost. Did that probably about 1.5 years ago, and it really has cleaned up the material. Now we say it's food only that we will accept, and if there's something other than food in there, it's easy to identify. It's easy to see that there's something there that shouldn't be. And so it's, on one hand, it's unfortunate that we weren't able to recover more of those products that now have to go into the landfill, but at the end of the day, we have to have a product that we can sell. That's really our goal in doing all of this. It's to have a product that we can sell to gardeners and landscapers and incorporate it into our soil blends. It's a wonderful product, but not if it's got plastic and contamination in there. And so I'll probably do another series on contamination, and I'll touch on this and then some other contamination issues as well. But that basically brings us up to today, where we still have a landscape supply company. We've diversified into a lot of other areas with organic processing. There's this distribution and application of these materials and that type of thing. So the company's kind of diversified in that, but the roots of the company really were in recycling wood waste residuals and residual organic products, and so that's kind of how we got where we are today. Thank you.